Hi. In this video note session, we're going to continue our discussion on plant diversity. Specifically, we'll talk about seed plants. So seed plants, as all the other plants, have made the move to land, but they made the move to land really, really successfully. There's a reason why the most common kind of plants have seeds. So seed plants, of course, reproduce using seeds, and they have many, many adaptations that are required for true independence on land. Among them is being able to reproduce without water, because the flowers or the cones that make the seeds protect the embryo and the seeds, and therefore they don't require water, and they don't require that the sperm swim to the egg. Seed plants are heteroporous. That means that they make two different types of spores that develop into either male or female gametophytes. Most of the time, one plant will have both type of gametophytes, but they have two different types. In both cases, the gametophytes are much, much smaller than the sporophyte. In fact, what you're used to seeing is the sporophyte. The female gametophyte is usually protected within the plant, and the male is dispersed as pollen. Once fertilization happens, that happens at the flower or at the cone, and then the embryo develops in the flower and the cone. As I mentioned, seed plants are very, very successful in land. That's because seeds provide a lot of adaptations, a lot of advantages. The first of which is the seed coat. The seed coat prevents drying out. It also helps protect the embryo from pathogens that could otherwise get in without the seed coat. It also allows for dormancy. Remember, being able to wait until conditions are favorable makes a plant much, much more successful than if they just have to reproduce when there's enough water to, for example. It also, most seeds have structures that aid in dispersal. So many seeds are encased in fruit. Other seeds have adaptations to catch the wind. And so they aid in the offspring being further away from the parent plant and from other siblings, if you will. And that increases the likelihood that one of the plant's offspring or one of the plant's seeds will grow into an adult plant. Developing on the female is also an adaptation that allows for the female in a way to protect the plant and ensures more complex development. And then lastly, but certainly not most importantly, you probably know that a lot of animals, including humans, eat seeds because they're very nutritious. The reason why they're very nutritious is because the seed packs in food for the embryo. So the embryo has some energy stores to use while it's in dormancy and while it's first starting to grow until it's able to make its own food. Let's take a few moments and review. So there's two different kinds of seed plants. One is a gymnosperm, which reproduces with cones, and the other is angiosperms, which reproduce with flowers. I think my memory trick is Angie likes flowers. I think Angie is a girl's name, and girls tend to like flowers. Not to be stereotypical, though. So gymnosperms, they are known for having naked seeds. In other words, the seeds are exposed. They're not developing in an ovary like we would see in an angiosperm. The ovary, by the way, is like a fruit. The seeds are on cones instead, and you're probably familiar with it. There are actually two different kinds of cones. So there's the female cone, which is significantly larger, and it has scales on it. The scales just refer to the little spikes on the cone, and the ovules are found at the base of the scales. Meiosis produces megaspores, which are multicellular, so there's hundreds of cells big enough to see, and each one has 2 to 6 archegonia, in other words, ovule-producing structures. They're also sticky so that they can catch the pollen. The male cone is significantly smaller. In fact, it usually disintegrates after releasing the spores, and there are hundreds of sporangia on it. After meiosis, it produces microspores, which are then pollen grains. They're carried in the air. The pollen grains, because they're carried in the air, need adaptations for that, and so we see in this, the picture on the right is a microscope image. This is a diagram, but we see these structures here. They're kind of like wings, and they help it catch the wind so that it can pollinate other plants. This is the full life cycle of a gymnosperm. Take a moment and analyze it with your life cycle diagrams. It's not exactly the same version, but we see that in a seed plant, the haploid life cycle is much, much smaller, and the entire gametophyte stage exists on the sporophyte. So the gametophyte stage would be the pollen grains and the ovules, and that is entirely within the cones. And so we don't have a separate life cycle. It's still a separate life stage, but it's not a separate life plant that you're ever going to go, oh, there's a gametophyte for a gymnosperm. Let's take another moment and review. So there are 4 divisions of gymnosperms, one of which is very, very common and very, very recognizable. The other 3 might be a little bit more foreign to you. So Conurphyta are the conifers, and certainly you're familiar with these. Conifers are the most diverse and most prolific division of gymnosperm. So there's pine trees, spruces, firs, cypress, redwoods. All of these are conifers, most of which are considered evergreen, although certainly not all. And many are adapted for very long winters with lots of snow and low light. So they have lots and lots of adaptations for this. So one of which is that they're, instead of having flat, broad leaves, its leaves are needle-shaped, which allows it to hold the snow much better. The needles also do a different kind of photosynthesis, slightly different version of photosynthesis that allows it to take advantage of lower light. They're evergreen, which means that they don't have periods of time when they're not doing photosynthesis. Most of these plants are in places where if they were to spend time in the winter dormant, they would spend a lot of time dormant because they're in places where winter is very, very long. The cone shape helps snow fall off of them. Some, as I mentioned, are not evergreens like the bald cypress. You'll see here. Conifers are incredibly important. So conifers are some of the largest and oldest organisms. So sequoias and redwoods are hundreds or sometimes thousands of years old, and they're both conifers. They have adaptations to help them survive fires. I'll talk about that in a bit. Conifers are also the basis for taiga or boreal forests, sometimes called coniferous forests. We see those up north and in Canada and Alaska and places basically between where we are and the tundra. Many are adapted for fire. The living part of the tree is the bark, and so sequoias and redwoods, a lot of times you see burned out in the center, and that's an adaptation that helped them survive over thousands of years as forest fires come and go. Important for building supplies, obviously they're very heavily harvested. This is what I was talking about with the adaptations for fire. The picture here right next to my picture is of a serotinous cone. So we see that in lodgepole pine and white pine, and actually a lot of the pines and other plants adapted for fire. And that is, it's a really waxy cone that the only time that particular kind of cone releases its seeds is when the wax is melted for fire. They make other kinds of cones too, but that's an adaptation to help them be some of the first that recover after a fire. Let's take another moment and review. Another gymnosperm division is a Ginkgophyta. You probably heard of Ginkgo biloba. It's the only species in the entire division. It's also one of the oldest seed plants. It is deciduous, so it loses its leaves in winter. And something that's uncommon for plants is that there's different male and female species. Actually, male and female individuals. Most plants are both male parts and female parts. Ginkgos are important for a number of reasons. Increasingly, they're planted in cities because they do pretty well in polluted environments. Some people believe that there are medicinal applications. There's some dangerous side effects when taken without the supervision of a doctor. They're also used for, as you can see here, for horticulture and supplements. They have that very characteristic leaf. Their cone is a little bit unusual too. Another group of gymnosperms is Gnetophyta. There are just 3 different orders that have 70 different species. They tend to be very old. They can live for thousands of years. So the 3 orders, there's Cnetum, which is a tropical climbing plant. Ephedra, which is more of a desert shrub. Ephedra, you might have heard of as ephedrine, which is used for medicine. But it also, again, unsupervised, can be a very dangerous supplement. And welwitschia is their third one. Welwitschia grows in the deserts of Africa, and it's the goofiest plant. I'll show you on the next slide. And it has very deep roots. It takes in water through the leaves as well. All three are adapted to live in either dry climates or mountains. If we take a look, here's the Netum that looks more tropical than the rest. Ephedra would be these three. Notice the unusual cones. And again, it's used as an herb. And welwitschia is this goofy plant. It looks almost like a dead leaf decaying on the ground, but it's alive, and it's this humongous, sprawling, leafy structure, but it makes cones. It reproduces with cones. The last of the four divisions is Cycadophyta, or cycads. I have one in the back of my classroom. They look like small palms. They're grown in the tropics, and they're, once again, either male or female, like the ginkgo, and they're very commonly used in horticulture. This is what they look like. A lot of times they're mistaken for palms. Notice their cone is very unusual, and it's at the base of the plant, when then there is, there we go, then there is the leaves and the structures above it. Let's take a minute and review the gymnosperms. The other type of seed plant is called an angiosperm. As I mentioned, my memory trick is Angie loves flowers. Lots of girls do. Boys too, but lots of girls. So angiosperms, more recently used name is Anthophyta, although angiosperms remains very, very commonly used. It's the most successful because, of course, it has the most adaptations. It's also very ubiquitous, meaning you find it just about everywhere. 75% of the plants in the plant kingdom are angiosperms or Anthophyta. And their main claim to fame is they have evolved flowers and fruit, which makes reproduction very, very successful. The reason why is that flowers and fruit increase the likelihood of pollination, and it aids in dispersal of the seed. The fruit also helps protect the seed and makes it last longer until conditions are right. Traditional fruit, nuts, berries, grains, wheat, rye, and oats are all fruit, even though we sometimes only think of something that looks like an orange as a fruit. All of those are all examples of fruit. What angiosperms all have in common is that fruit, and so the fruit is the ovary, and seeds develop in that inside of that. Let's take a minute and review angiosperms. Let's talk briefly about the angiosperm life cycle, so you may want to make some notes on your angiosperm handout. So angiosperms resembles the other vascular plant life cycles in that the gametophyte stage is very, very small and reduced, and that it develops on the plant, on the sporophyte plant. The one exception, of course, is that the seeds are developing in an ovary. The duration of the lifespan varies, and this is something that's not necessarily life cycle information, but something that's important just as a human being to know as a functioning adult. So make sure you get in your notes. So there are some plants that are called annuals. When you go to the store to buy plants for summer, you'll see them labeled as annuals or perennials. So annuals are ones that complete their life cycle in a year. Most vegetables are annuals. A lot of the plants that we put in our pots and our hanging baskets and things are annuals because they have lots of flowers to try to make the most advantage of their 1 year life cycle. Biennial would be 2 years. That would be like carrots and pansies. Perennials are the other really common one. They live and come back every year. So perennials, typically when you buy them at at Home Depot or whatever, they cost more because they'll come back. But then once you've planted them, you cut them down in the winter and they come right back up next spring. And so there's some advantages to each. Perennials typically bloom for part of the season, although some bloom for longer. Annuals for the whole summer, but then you have to buy new ones the next year. Take a look at the life cycle. Once again, we have the microspore and the megaspore, the micro being the male and the mega being the female. In this case, the female is at the base of the female reproductive part, which is called the pistil. And after pollination, which comes from the pollen grains, the microspore of the gametophyte, it is caught by the sticky substance at the top, travels down a pollen tube where fertilization happens, and usually there's double fertilization. The first fertilization is for the seed, and the second one is for the ovary, and from there the embryo develops with a fruit around it, and from there that's what we use to grow new seeds. And let's take a second and review angiosperm life cycles. Finally, there's two classes of angiosperms. One is called monocots and the other is called eudicots, although in lots of textbooks you'll see it written as monocots and dicots. The reason why is that monocots have one cotyledon, or a seed leaf. In other words, it's a leaf that's contained as part of the seed structure, and when the seed germinates, or in other words starts to grow, it's the first part of it's the first leaf to come out, and it's used to do photosynthesis until a true leaf is growing. So monocots are characterized by having one cotyledon inside the seed. Dicots naturally have two cotyledons. Eudicots, because of the pollen structure, they've changed the name, but like I said, both are pretty well used. We're going to go over the differences in lab, so leave a little bit of space in your notes for this. Finally, let's review just one more time. That's it for this video note session that wraps up our discussion on plant diversity. As always, make sure you let me know if you have any questions.